Thank you. The next item of business is a Green Party debate on motion 24030 in the name of Patrick Harvie on unexplained wealth orders Donald Trump. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Patrick Harvie to speak to and move the motion. Mr Harvie, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This is a story that goes back a long way. In previous chapters, we saw two successive First Ministers, Jack McConnell and Alex Salmond, actively courting the business interest of Donald Trump, despite knowing already what kind of character he was. We saw the Scottish planning system overturned for him. We saw the highest level of environmental protection that any land in Scotland is able to have overturned as well, proved worthless in the end against an environmentally destructive development. Even before Trump's candidacy or presidency, he was known around the world to be an untrustworthy, dishonest, racist conspiracy theorist. This was never someone that we should have wanted to associate Scotland's good name with. Now he's a disgraced former president who left office only after attempting to overturn a democratic election and incite a violent mob at the capital, a mob composed of the people he had radicalised, the conspiracists, the white supremacists, the religious extremists, the grifters of a Republican Party which enabled him. Some people were shocked. Others thought this behaviour entirely predictable and in character. Now that it's all over, maybe some people think he should just go back to being the global joke that he was before he became a global threat. But people who abuse political office need to be held accountable, not only as a matter of direct justice, but also as a clear signal to those who come after them that they won't get away with such abuse. That's why the definition of a politically exposed person in the legislation which provides for unexplained wealth orders does make it clear that this status continues after the person has left office. So this mechanism is no less relevant to Trump now that he's out of power. The reasons for the concerns about his financial conduct are long-standing, as detailed in many places, including reports published by Avaz and given to the Scottish Government. The purchases in Scotland were part of a very long spending spree, with his spokespeople claiming he had vast sums of money sitting around available for investment, while at the same time he was apparently being turned down for credit. As the Avaz report given to the Scottish Government says, investigations by the US Department of Justice Office of Special Counsel, the US Congress and others have unearthed a wealth of evidence tying Mr Trump to alleged financial misconduct, including opening questions about Mr Trump's financial dealings in Scotland. And we all know that a number of Trump's former associates have been investigated, some prosecuted and convicted, including for crimes of dishonesty and financial misconduct. But neither the time nor the need is here right now to go through every single detail of the concerns and questions which surround Trump's business dealings. That's not what this debate has to be about. We all know what the investigations have shown. The point for today, and the issue we bring to the Chamber, is that it's for Scottish ministers to take action. I totally understand the principle of independent prosecutors acting without any kind of control or guidance in terms of individual cases when it comes to individual criminal prosecutions. It would be completely wrong for ministers to decide who should be prosecuted and who not. What we're talking about here is not a prosecution. What we're talking about here is merely going to court and asking for information to be provided. And as the legal opinion recently published by Avaz makes clear, it is a matter of political responsibility for the government. It is simply not possible, they say, as a matter of law, for the Scottish ministers, including the First Minister, to insulate themselves from the responsibility, both legal and political, accountability for decisions concerning unexplained wealth orders in Scotland. Even if the immediate departmental responsibility for the operation of seeking UWOs has been allocated to the Lord Advocate, this can only be simply for purposes of administrative convenience or efficiency. It does not and cannot change the legal responsibilities of the Scottish ministers. So, Presiding Officer, these are reasonable questions to ask a court to put to the Trump organisation. If they can provide reasonable answers to reasonable questions, then they have no problem. But it's the Scottish Government and Scottish ministers who have a responsibility to ask those questions, and they cannot maintain the position that they have no ability to act. They do, and so does this Parliament. I move the motion, and I ask that all members back this necessary and actually relatively modest step toward accountability.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvie. I now call Hamza Youssef to speak to and move Amendment 24030.1. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Presiding Officer, let me make it clear before I go into the detail of this motion and indeed our amendment that, frankly, I find former President Donald Trump a deplorable individual. I don't say that lightly, but as a person of colour, as a Muslim, I'm exactly the type of person who would be the target of his racist and divisive policies if I was living in America. So you'll find no defence of Donald Trump from me or indeed from this government. However, we rightly have a separation of the political and indeed law enforcement. Just because I do not like someone, or indeed simply because something might be to my political advantage, I should not exercise any power that allows me to instigate an investigation or indeed law enforcement processes against such individuals. I would not do such a thing to somebody I do like. That must also apply equally to those I do not like. And Donald Trump is at the top of that list. That would be an abuse of power, fundamentally undermining our entire justice system. Let me turn to the detail of the motion and the amendment in my name. The amendment to the motion calls on Parliament, of course, to recognise that there are calls for an investigation or a UWO, an unexplained wealth order, to be sought into the finances of Donald Trump. I have had the emails from Avaz. They have led a campaign. The First Minister have had those emails. I suspect members right across the chamber have had those emails. So we recognise that there are calls for such an investigation. But my amendment to the Green motion also, I hope, makes it clear that it is for the Civil Recovery Unit, the CRU, to independently undertake the investigatory role associated with civil recovery in Scotland on behalf of Scottish ministers. And that this process must not be subject to any form of political interference. Of course I would.
Patrick Harvie.
I entirely recognise that the Scottish Government is entitled to delegate certain decisions to the Civil Recovery Unit or to the Lord Advocate. But that doesn't absolve the Scottish Cabinet and the ministers themselves of the political judgment that's necessary. And UWOs are specifically about politically exposed persons. Doesn't the Cabinet Secretary recognise there is a political judgment to be made here and the Cabinet needs to make it?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, he's incorrect in that, I would say, because what he is asking the Cabinet to do would be to make a political decision on instigating an investigation into an individual. That is not correct. We should never in Cabinet, and I've sat around many Cabinet meetings, we should never be discussing instigating an investigation into an individual. That would not be correct. So I disagree. And I'll go into more details of why I disagree with Mr Harvie. And I associate myself, I suspect, with Mr Harvie's judgment of former President Donald Trump. But decisions on applying for a UWO, an unexplained wealth order, are an operational matter for the CRU. The CRU is responsible to the Lord Advocate. He exercises an oversight function under POCA, the Proceeds of Crime Act, as one of the Scottish ministers. This arrangement was put in place, not by this administration, but actually by the previous administration in 2003. So while, of course, Mr Harvie is right that ministers could apply, I don't think it is right that ministers, I don't think it would be right or proper for Scottish ministers, either individually or to answer his question collectively, other than the Lord Advocate, who is not a political minister, to become personally involved in the pursuit of a particular investigation into any one individual. To have a system of civil recovery under POCA, which could be influenced in individual cases by how well connected the person holding the assets is to a government minister, or how disliked they are by a particular government, is not one which a society which respects and seeks to uphold the rule of law should aspire to. And that is the crucial point. To conclude, Presiding Officer, Mr Harvie has called on Scottish ministers to use the powers under the Proceeds of Crime Act, but he is not recognising that the CRU undertake their impartial investigatory role on behalf of Scottish ministers, and they report directly to the Lord Advocate, a non-political minister. Scotland is a nation that upholds the rule of law, no matter how much I or we as a government dislike any individual. To preserve the integrity of an investigation into the activities of any individual, there must not be any political interference in the process of seeking an unexplained wealth order.
I can't recall. Did you move your amendment, Cabinet Secretary?
I moved the amendment in my name, Presiding Officer.
You may have moved it twice, but so be it. And now call Liam Kerr to open with the Conservatives, please.
Yes, thank you, Presiding Officer. With just 4 minutes to contribute to this debate, I shall be brief and also remind the Chamber that I'm a member of the legal profession, although an employment law specialist, not a criminal law specialist. I've listened to Mr Harvie set out his case as to why he believes ministers should apply to the Court of Session for an unexplained wealth order in respect of Donald Trump's property transactions in Scotland. Mr Harvie has presumably satisfied himself the Court would be satisfied that there are reasonable grounds for suspecting that Donald Trump would not have been able to obtain the property with lawfully earned income, and furthermore, that the Court would be satisfied that Donald Trump is suspected of involvement in serious crime or is a politically exposed person who's vulnerable to bribery and corruption, being, as I understand it, the prerequisites for the Court to grant such an order. Should such an order be made, Mr Trump would be required to set out the nature and extent of his involvement with the particular property. He would require to explain how it was obtained, including how any costs incurred in obtaining it were met, and setting out other information in connection with the property which may be relevant. Presumably, Mr Harvie feels either that Mr Trump cannot so satisfy the Court or that he will fail to do so, such that there may be a presumption that the property is recoverable under any subsequent civil recovery action. Now, I believe it is Mr Harvie's case that whilst the Crown Office might instigate such an application to the Court of Session on their own volition, given he believes it has chosen not to, the Scottish ministers may do so. And he argues, praying in aid of legal opinion by Aidan O'Neill QC, that the First Minister in a government can apply to the Court of Session. Now, Mr Harvie may well be correct that if there are serious concerns about how Donald Trump financed the purchase of his Scottish golf courses, it might be considered odd that no investigation has ever taken place. But hasn't it? I note the government amendment specifically references that the Civil Recovery Unit undertakes an independent investigatory role as an enforcement authority for Scotland under the Proceeds of Crime Act. And I listened to the Cabinet Secretary talking there of its independence. But also the amendment talks, crucially, that the unit does not confirm nor deny the existence of any investigation taking place. Nevertheless, the question of whether an unexplained wealth order should or should not be sought ought surely to be a matter for the Crown Office. It is independent, and I'm sure Mr Harvie would agree the criminal justice system ought not to be, nor be seen to be, subject to political pressure. In essence, my worry would be that whilst this legal opinion may say the government could petition the Court of Session, that doesn't mean that they should. One cannot help but wonder whether to do so would risk compromising the integrity of any prosecution and judicial process, as well as the perception of independence of the Crown Office. I really don't have time, Mr Harvie. Of course, Crown Office investigations must not be motivated by political pressure, and to try and influence the Crown Office would be inappropriate. I didn't find Mr Harvie's differentiation between political pressure and seeking information particularly persuasive. On the contrary, I found the Cabinet Secretary's response to the earlier intervention to be well founded. And therefore, while it's not for these benches to answer on behalf of the Scottish ministers, and the Cabinet Secretary has, and in closing no doubt will set out the reasoning for either choosing to use or choosing not to use any powers they have, it doesn't feel wise for Parliament to seek to require the Crown Office to pursue what some might feel to be a politically motivated investigation, particularly in the context of the recent challenges that we heard about in this chamber only yesterday over malicious prosecutions. Finally, Presiding Officer, I conclude with a simple observation. We are in the middle of a pandemic that has taken a terrible toll on the people of Scotland. Parliament needs to be 100% focused on our economic recovery and rebuilding Scotland from this pandemic. And we should be working together, as I look forward to doing, in the national interest to manage this crisis and rebuild our country. And for that reason, and the others I've set out earlier, I shall vote accordingly at decision time tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr Kerr. Now call Alec Rowley to open for Labour. 3 minutes, Mr Rowley. Thank you.
Thank you, President Officer. I'm pleased to open for Labour to be in this debate, calling on the Scottish Ministers to use their powers under the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002 to seek the grant of an unexplained wealth order in respect to Donald Trump's property transactions in Scotland. We support this motion and do agree that there are valid questions to be answered about the acquisition and exploitation of Scottish property by former President of the US, Donald Trump. The case for doing this has been set out by Patrick Harvie in his opening remarks and by the campaign group of us, who published a full report back in 2019 into the need to launch an unexplained wealth order investigation into Donald Trump's all cash purchases of Turnberry Golf Course, as well as the legal analysis of why an unexplained wealth order is appropriate in this instance. Given the wealth of evidence in relation to financial misconduct by the former president, which I can't go into today because we would be here all day, I'm remiss to see why the Scottish Government is so hesitant to pursue this course of action. The Government amended to the motion today says it believes that to preserve the rule of law, there must not be political interference in the enforcement of the law. However, the Criminal Finance Act 2017, which introduced unexplained wealth orders, clearly states, and I quote, "The Court of Session may, on an application made by the Scottish Ministers, make an unexplained wealth order in respect of any property if the court is satisfied that each of the requirements for the making of the order is fulfilled." The legal claim from the Scottish Government to seek an unexplained wealth order is quite clear. So it begs the question, why is this not the case? Why is the Scottish Government so hesitant to use the powers available to it? I find it quite amazing that these powers have never been used in Scotland. We have at our disposal a means to target politically exposed persons and those involved with serious crime to explain how certain property ownership came about. I do think that it is unreasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable for action that could be used more fully in Scotland to be used, and certainly in relation to Trump, given the massive question mark over so much of his financial affairs. So I don't buy what the says. We will support the motion, and I would hope the Government would look at this issue again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Rowley. I now call Liam MacArthur to open for Liberal Democrats. Mr MacArthur, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let's be clear, the unexplained wealth order was specifically designed to bring transparency to the murkiest of dealings. All today's motion does is call on Scottish ministers to use their power as set out in the legislation. Because the Proceeds of Crime Act, as amended, allows for the Court of Session to make an order, quote, on an application made by the Scottish ministers. The Scottish Government claims this power rests entirely with the Civil Recovery Unit, who report directly to the Lord Advocate, an argument the Cabinet Secretary has relied on again today. But this is a decision-making process designed by ministers. The power to apply rests with the Scottish Government as a whole. That is what the legislation says. It's then the court's decision whether or not to grant an order. That's not just my interpretation. The Lord Advocate confirmed as much when I raised this with him last March. In a letter to me, he stated, and I quote, "Scottish ministers are the enforcement authority for the purposes of civil recovery proceedings in Scotland. This function is fulfilled on their behalf." So the Scottish Government's contention, as set out again in their amendment, that the unexplained wealth order is a question for the CRU and the CRU alone, doesn't stack up. Over the last year, many of my constituents have shared with me their deep concerns about the way in which the Trump retreats were purchased. These concerns may be misplaced, they may not. But the Lord Advocate's response is hardly reassuring. I was told to, quote, appreciate that the work of the CIU is necessarily of a sensitive nature and that the unit responsible for unexplained wealth orders could therefore neither confirm nor deny the existence of an ongoing investigation. Then, obviously, that response is even less transparent than the business dealings of Trump himself. As the Avaz report explains, the unexplained wealth orders is a legislative tool that should compel transparency where there are questions to be answered. Today's motion does not try to preempt the findings of any such investigation. It simply asks Scottish ministers to make use of the power that rests with them. Not enough to stand idly by. If the Scottish Government is genuinely interested in preserving the rule of law, then it must ensure that it's upheld without fear or favour, President or not. And so Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting the motion at decision time this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms MacArthur. Now call Emma Harper to be followed by Colin Smith. Then we go to closing speeches. Emma Harper, please.
Presiding officer, like everyone in chamber, my main concern right now is the COVID virus, the vaccination programme and bringing the pandemic under control. But even with the pandemic consuming the majority of our time and attention, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been gripped by the shocking situation and the Búrach in the United States recently. Before I address the motion, I remind Chamber I spent 14 years living in the United States and I'm married to an American, and I want to say how relieved I am that Donald Trump is no longer in a position of power and that the disorder, the division and the chaos created in government can now begin to be rectified and repaired. Send my heartfelt congratulations to President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, and I hope for a brighter future for America. It's a wonderful country full of many wonderful people, and I enjoyed my time there immensely. In a failed attempt to overturn his defeat, Donald Trump fed the myth that the election was stolen. He told his mob of supporters that strength they would need to take back their country, and then this mob stormed the US Capitol building. So we need to not forget that 5 citizens died and dozens more were injured in that day. What we need to be really careful of is that we have no more presidents that stoke the fires of racism and misogyny, and that this will be the last president to ridicule people with disabilities. Presiding officer, to turn to the substance of today's debate, I of course agree that Scotland is a country which is law-abiding and stands against corruption, tax evasion, money laundering and other financial illegalities. In Martin McLaughlin's article in The Scotsman yesterday, he wrote, and I quote, "Since incorporating his first company in Scotland 16 years ago, none of Mr. Trump's companies have turned a profit, and publicly available accounts show that they've run up losses of £55 million and owe around £157 million to US-based limited liability companies and trusts in Mr. Trump's name. Companies' house records for both Trump's golf course resorts. Neither has paid a penny in UK corporation tax. And his transactions in Scotland in the Avaz campaigning report is really interesting reading. And if anybody is able to read it, I would encourage them to do so, presiding officer. There's a couple of paragraphs that are really important that outline or show that at the time of the Balmeady and the Turnberry golf resorts being purchased, there was misconduct amongst Mr. Trump's inner circle. And as a result of the inquiry, Mr. Trump's former campaign manager has pled guilty to money laundering, his former deputy campaign manager to conspiring to defraud the United States, and his personal lawyer to 8 criminal counts, including campaign finance violations and tax fraud. I'm conscious of time, presiding officer, but I support the Scottish Government's amendment and I look forward to closing comments from members. Thank you.
Yes, I'm glad you noticed the time, Ms Harper. A very interesting contribution, but I don't know if you actually spoke to the amendment much, but I've got a light touch this afternoon. I call Colin Smith, please.
Pleased to hear it, Presiding Officer. Thank you. Like most members, I celebrated the results of the US presidential elections. I counted down the days to Joe Biden's inauguration, and when it was mooted that rather than attend the inauguration, Donald Trump would fly into Prestwick en route to Turnberry in my South Scotland region to play golf, I urge UK and Scottish governments to nip such talk in the bud and make clear this is a travel restriction that would be enforced. The only place, Presiding Officer, that people wanted to see Donald Trump travel to was out the door of the White House. Given the hatred he generates, the violence he incites, I also said I hoped Scotland had seen the back of Donald Trump. He's been an absentee owner of Trump Turnberry since he bought it, and to be honest, with financial losses year on year, the Trump organisation has been as successful at running the resort as their founder has been at being president. In the summer, the Trump organisation showed their true colours when they used the pandemic to try to axe 80 workers at Turnberry, as well as worsen working conditions, despite receiving public funds during the COVID pandemic. I supported the campaign by the RMT union to protect jobs and conditions amid fears that the company planned to casualise the workforce. And I tabled a motion on the matter, which, as an aside, didn't get support from the Greens. However, I do support the Greens' motion today. In these discussions, however, on the valid questions over how the sudden cash spending spree was funded that allowed Trump to purchase a string of houses and golf courses, including Turnberry, we should not lose sight of the livelihoods of the workforce at the resort and the importance of it to the local economy. Turnberry is a fantastic hotel, it has a rich history, it's got great golf courses. Actually, its importance to the economy is one of the reasons I do want to see the back of Trump's ownership. The Trump brand is being diminished by the day, and it would be a positive move if this fine venue could be freed from the discredited Trump name under a new, credible owner who would give staff some long-term security and who didn't have so many questions over their finances. In the meantime, there clearly are grounds for carrying out further investigations of how the current owner acquired Turnberry and a strong public interest for doing so. The Scottish Government have been keen to avoid responsibility for this decision, insisting that applying for an unexplained wealth order is exclusively in the remit of the Crown Office. But we've all seen the legal advice put forward by Avaz, which directly contradicts this position, claiming that under the 2002 Act, the Lord Advocate is acting in his role as a Minister of the Scottish Government when making this decision, not in his role as the head of the prosecution system. It's also important to say that an unexplained wealth order is a civil power, not a criminal one. It does not necessarily make accusations of criminality, but it's used to ensure everything is in order. It's clear that in this case, the threshold for applying for an unexplained wealth order also appears to have been more than met in light of the alarming questions being raised by investigations in the US over Donald Trump.
The member is in his last seconds.
I was literally in my last sentence, but I'm sure that the Cabinet Secretary will pick up the point in his closing comments. But, Presiding Officer, I do believe the Scottish Government have a case to apply for this order, and they should get on with seeking such an order.
Thank you. I call on Alec Rowley to close for Labour, please. 3 minutes, Mr Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. An interesting point that Emma Harper did make, I thought, in terms of Trump and his impact on America. America is a deeply, deeply divided states, the divided states of America. And there's a lesson there for politicians in our country that when politicians try and divide and sow the seeds of division the way that we have seen, then you get an outcome like that. But back to the point of the debate today, I think the Cabinet Secretary is basically hiding behind the law. He commonly has a lot of rhetoric about what he doesn't like, but then fails to actually take the action that's necessary. And that's what we see here, because if Avaz have said there are two critical questions Scottish ministers have both the power and the justification to seek answers to. How did Mr Trump raise enough liquid assets to buy Turnberry up front, given what is known about his financial straits at the time, is one question. And was Scotland exploited as a money laundering haven? These are legitimate questions that ministers should want to seek the answers to. Now, I can understand why the Tories would not want to seek answers to those types of questions. But what I can't understand is how MPs continually team up with the Tories, as they will again tonight, to block legitimate concerns that are being raised. And there are legitimate concerns and legitimate questions that this Parliament that parliamentarians are raising, and we have Hamza Yousaf hiding behind some legal argument that's all down to the Lord Advocate. The Avars basically state in the case that they've put, in the present case, i.e. Trump, it seems that the First Minister is saying that she has designated the Lord Advocate to be the relevant Scottish Minister carrying out the Unexplained Health Order portfolio. Because of the wording of Section 396A of the 2002 Act, any such appointment by the First Minister of the Lord Advocate can only be in his capacity as one of the Scottish ministers. As such, any decision by him in his capacity as her designated minister with immediate responsibility in relation to the administration and operation of the UWO regime remain at all times in the same ones which fails within the collective responsibility of Scottish ministers. So the question is, Scottish ministers have the power to do that. The power sits with Scottish ministers, and Mr Yousaf should come off the fence, stop hiding behind the Lord Advocate. This is a responsibility of government, and I would urge you to support the Greens motion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Gordon Lyndhurst to close for the Conservatives, please. Mr Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. By now, unexplained wealth orders are a well-established part of Scotland's ability to tackle criminal wealth and property retention in this country. That is, they are a well-established possibility. But as a legal process, their basis and investigation, should they be used, should be entirely independent of government. In other words, non-political. No one, including politicians, should be above the law, but at the same time, the law should treat everyone equally, including politicians. The old statue of justice holding up a set of scales blindfolded may be familiar to us, but the picture presented by the statue is a very real one. The law in action in the justice system should be fair and balanced in its application. So it is understandable why the Scottish Government, quite rightly in my view, is hesitant to do what is asked of it in this case. Because these orders should not just be unavailable to be used as a political tool, they should be above suspicion of being used as a political tool. The old legal adage, nemo iudex in sua causa, no man may be the judge in his own cause, reminds us that that principle goes far beyond the judge's chair in the courtroom and reaches indeed to the Crown Office and those who work there. Certainty of law, another eternal principle of justice, means that individuals, whoever they be, should not be subject to criminal proceedings simply because of the views of those who happen to hold elected office at any given time, who may, like a certain recently replaced president of a major North American country, be here today and gone tomorrow. The ballot box being where such issues should and have always in a democracy been decided. The Crown Office in Scotland is featured in the news lately, and I'm sure that no one listening to this has missed that. And what we as a Parliament should be focused on in this Scottish Parliament is getting our own house in order here in Scotland. Now, that focus has been sadly lacking at times from the current SNP government, but even they recognise the difficulty with this motion as placed before the Parliament. The proposed amendment by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice notes the need for absence of political interference in the enforcement of law, and I, for one, welcome that. I will conclude by saying that it is the Crown Office which should be best placed to ascertain if the criteria for the basis of an unexplained wealth order exists, and as, how, and if the matter should be investigated. And that is where it should lie, whatever the power is available, and not with politicians. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Hamza Yousaf to close for the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, 3 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I will try to address some of the remarks made in contributions today. It seems that we all have a universal dislike of the former President Donald Trump. But as I have said in my opening remarks, whether I dislike or like somebody is irrelevant. There should not be political interference in an investigatory process. Whether that is criminal or civil in an investigatory process that could lead to subsequent law enforcement processes being enacted, there should not be, must not be, political interference in that, regardless of how I like, dislike, or how the government views an individual or not. I want to address some of the points made. Liam MacArthur mentioned that Scottish ministers can apply for a UWO. I'm not disputing that point in law. What I am saying that although that power is conferred on Scottish ministers, though we do operate, often when Scottish ministers are referenced in law, we operate as one legal person. While we have that power, rightly, we do not use that power, and instead the CRU, the Civil Recovery Unit, acts independently, operationally independently, and the Lord Advocate, as the non-political minister in the government, exercises an oversight function. That keeps the work of the CRU at arm's length from any political interference, just as the way it should be. Liam MacArthur also asked the question, or seemed to cast some doubt as to why the CRU or the government, for example, would neither confirm nor deny whether an investigation was taking place. And he seemed to say that that was not for good reason. But it is for good reason, because if the CRU was to confirm an investigation was taking place, or that they'd applied for a UWO, which is an investigatory tool, then that individual could, of course, dissipate their assets, hide their wealth, conceal their wealth, and so on and so forth. So actually, there is really good reason not to confirm nor deny the existence of an investigation. And I would simply say this, that any member who says there is not an investigation going on is merely speculating, because it is for the CRU to neither confirm nor deny such an existence of any investigation. I would simply ask those who are finger-wagging at the government to go away and do something on this, and saying that we're hiding or obfuscating or sitting on the fence, as Alex Rowley described it. What possible motive would the Scottish government have in terms of our political stance, in terms of any other, actually, motive? What possible motive would the government have for not applying for an unexplained wealth order, other than the reasons I have given to preserve the integrity of the justice system? So I won't speak to Alex Rowley's contribution. I thought it was one of the most immature and childish contributions, in fact, lacking in any understanding of the most basic principle of the rule of law. I will conclude, Presiding Officer, simply by saying that it is fundamental that any investigatory process that could then lead to subsequent law enforcement action should not be at the whim of politicians, must be free from political interference. And I hope that we can all agree to the government's motion, amendment, to the motion which I move in my
Thank
name.
you. I call on Patrick Harvie to close for the Green Party. Mr Harvie, please.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank members for taking part in what was deliberately a short debate, partly because of the need to prioritise COVID, and partly because this issue needs a decision rather than a lengthy debate. And it certainly wasn't intended as finger-wagging, as the Cabinet Secretary, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, described it. Mr Youssef called Trump deplorable, but he maintains that it's not for ministers to act as ministers. I would say that holding someone like Trump accountable, specifically as what is defined in law as a politically exposed person, is a political choice, and a legitimate one. And as other authorities around the world prepare to do so, we should play our part. I think the SNP does regret its previous errors in courting Trump, even though some of the individuals involved at that time remain in high office today. And I hope that their predecessors in the Labour-Lib Dem coalition also regret doing so. Alec Rowley and Liam MacArthur's comments seem to suggest that they do regret it. Everybody knew what sort of person he was, but perhaps they didn't see the scale of the threat that he posed or the damage Scotland's reputation might suffer from association with the toxic Trump brand. Liam Kerr and the Cabinet Secretary repeatedly expressed this concern, though, about independent prosecution. And I say again, this is not a proposal for prosecution. It is simply about asking a court to seek answers to reasonable questions. And Colin Smith made that point well, I thought. It wouldn't surprise me if some Conservatives reject the case for accountability of Trump, given that so many of their own colleagues tried to normalise his politics or even praised him and his extremist movement. But I do welcome support from Labour and the Lib Dems, and I appeal to SNP members who recognise that Scotland made a serious error of judgment in inviting that toxic Trump brand into Scotland. Let's not just acknowledge the mistake. Let's set about seeking transparency, accountability, and the information that we need to answer those serious concerns which have been raised. Trump can no longer be dismissed as just an unpleasant bullying developer, no longer as a celebrity conspiracy theorist with offensive views. He became and remains a political danger, not only in the US, but globally. He's used his platform to promote fascists in this country. He still has links with far-right politicians here. So the threat that he brought to Congress a few weeks ago is by no means limited to the US. If these suspicions of financial illegal practices were swirling around a disgraced former president of a developing country, or an undemocratic country, a country perhaps in Africa or Eastern Europe, I don't think there's any doubt that we would act. And the unexplained wealth mechanism, the unexplained wealth order is the mechanism which is the obvious way to act, and it would have been done by now. I give way.
Briefly, Cabinet
But
Secretary.
can I just make sure that Mr Harvie is not insinuating that if the President was a person of colour, that somehow we would be treating him any differently? Because I would take pretty great exception if that was the insinuation from Patrick Harvie.
Patrick Harvie.
I think that a country less powerful than the US would be treated differently. And I don't lay that at the Cabinet Secretary's door, as he clearly is saying he's not making any decisions about this at all. He's leaving it to others to decide. I think a country other than the US would have been treated differently. Let's not refuse to do this simply because this is a dodgy character who's held office in a more powerful country. That makes it more of a priority, not less. Let's clearly assert, Presiding Officer, that Scotland is not the kind of country where anybody with money, no matter how they came by it, can rock up, buy a slice of our country, do what they like with it, trash our environment, and keep their business dealings opaque. Let us say clearly that they will be held accountable.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvie. And that concludes the Green Party debate on unexplained wealth orders, Donald Trump. And it's time to move on to the next item of business. There'll be a short pause.
You missed my show. See, when I say yes, you know you have to vote no. Not necessarily. Not always. Not always, okay.